Hey guys, it's Mrs. Shefchek here, and today we're going to do lesson 4.4 as a self-paced day. So we're working on multiplying rational numbers, and our learning target is that when you're done with this video, you can use the rules for multiplying integers to multiply rational numbers. And remember, those rational numbers are just fractions and decimals. In order to be ready for this video, you're going to need your textbook open to page 203. A pencil to write with, and then I would suggest having your notebook open so that you can either add notes as we go, or you can reference your fraction and decimal table. That would be really useful as you're converting between the two. Push play when you're ready to go. All right, on the top of page 203, you'll see a table about multiplying rational numbers, and we're going to use what you already know about multiplying positive and negative whole numbers to now doing it with rational numbers. So for this first one, if we have a positive times a negative, our answer is going to be a negative. With our second one, we've got a positive times a negative. Then we have a negative times a positive. We get a negative answer. And finally, when we have two negatives that we're multiplying, we get a positive answer. So just like with whole numbers, it's going to work the same with fractions and decimals. Our first example is on page 203, and you can either just watch as I do it, or you can write it in the margin on the same page. So the first problem we have is negative 3/4, and we're multiplying that by negative 7/9. Now, I like to do this where I ignore the signs for a little bit, and I'm just going to deal with these as two positive numbers. I'm going to go 3/4 times 7/9. Now, I could multiply straight across, and I'd get 21 over 36, but then I'd have to simplify it. So what I like to actually do first is divide by common factors. And when I do that, I'm looking diagonally or up and down to see if there's any common factors I can divide out. I call this simplify before you multiply. And it's a really helpful tool to help you make sure that you have less simplifying to do at the end. All right, so 3 and 9 both have a common factor of 3. So 3 divided by 3 is 1, 9 divided by 3 is 3. And then I'm checking this diagonal, and there are no common factors. So now I can just multiply across, and I get 7 over 12. And notice we had a negative times a negative, and so my answer is going to be a positive. Now, let's say I didn't simplify before I multiplied. I would have just multiplied across, and I would have gotten 21 over 36, but then I'd have to go in and divide each of these by that common factor of 3, and I would get 7/12. So either way you do it, you'll get the same answer, but I think you'll find it's easier if you can practice simplifying before you multiply. All right, I'd like you to pause the video and then complete the check on the top of page 204. Push play when you've got your work shown and you're ready to check. Make sure to simplify your answer. All right, so I've got negative 7/8 times 4/14. I'm going to end up with a negative product. So I'm going to ignore for just a moment that sign. And I'm going to simplify, divide 7 out of each of those. I can divide 4 out of here twice and 4 out of here once. And then when I multiply across, I get 1 times 1 and 2 times 2. So I end with a negative 1/4 as my final answer. Give yourself a little star on that one if you got it correct. All right, our next example comes from page 204, and this one is giving us some mixed numbers to multiply. So before we start, what do we need to do? Just like when we're adding and subtracting with fractions, we want to turn these into fractions first. So we have 3 times 5 is 15, plus 1 is 16/5, and that was a negative. And we're multiplying that by 14 plus 1, that's 15/4. All right, and so now I'm multiplying, and I've got two fractions. And what I can do here, I like to simplify before I multiply. So I'm checking my diagonals to see, are there any common factors in 16 and 14, or 5 and 15? All right, 5 and 15 are each divisible by 5. So 5 goes into 5 once. 5 goes into 15 3 times. And then 16 and 14 are both divisible by 2. So 14 divided by 2 is 7, and 16 divided by 2 is 8. And now I can just multiply straight across. I've got 8 times 3, that's 24. and 1 times 7 is 7. And then I'm going to go back and check my signs. I had a negative times a positive, so I'm going to have a negative answer. So I can leave it as negative 24/7, or if I want to turn it to a mixed number, I can say, well, 7 goes into 24 3 times, that's 21. And so that means I have 3/7 left over. And again, that's a negative 3 3/7. All right, now it's your turn again. I'd like you to push pause on the video as you solve the check on the bottom of page 204, and then push play once you've simplified your final answer. All right, I rewrote my mixed numbers as improper fractions. Now I'm going to simplify before I multiply. 8 and 12 are each divisible by 4. 4 goes in 3 times, 4 goes into 8 twice, and then 5 and 15 have a common factor of 5. So that becomes a 1, and this becomes a negative 3. And now I can just multiply straight across my fraction. 3 times 3 is 9. 2 times 1 is 2. And then I had a negative times a negative, so it's going to stay a positive answer. So I can leave it as 9/2, or I can turn it into 4 1/2. If I had done 4.5, that would have been fine as well. Because each of these are terminating decimals, if we turn them into decimals, we could work this one out in decimal form as well. I just found fractions easier on this one. Make sure to give yourself a star if you got this one correct. All right, the table on page 205 is really just explaining to you something that most of you probably already know, and that's when you're working with rational numbers in different forms, we've got to write them in the same form first. So whenever you have terminating decimals, those are the ones that stop or end, then you can do either decimals or fractions, either way. But when you're running into those non-terminating decimals or those repeating decimals, then we need to make sure that we're keeping them as fractions when we're multiplying with them. One thing that can be super helpful here too is referencing that common fraction to decimal chart in your notebook so that you can see if they're terminating or repeating before you work it out. The third example I want you to follow along with is on page 206, and this is example 3. So on this one, you're going to see we have a fraction and a decimal, and we have to decide before we start which form we want to use. Well, when I'm looking at this fraction right here, I know it's going to be a repeating decimal of 0.3 repeating. So in this case, I actually have to keep it in fraction, or I have to keep both of these in fraction form. So that means we need to take negative 2.75 and rewrite that as a fraction, or a mixed number. So I'm going to rewrite 1/3, and then I know that negative 2.75 is negative 2 3/4. All right, and then I need to turn that mixed number into an improper fraction. So I've got 1/3 times 8, 9, 10, 11 fourths, negative 11 fourths. All right, then I'm checking my diagonals for any common factors, and actually I don't see any, which means I can multiply straight across and know that my final answer is simplified. So 1 times 11 is 11, 3 times 4 is 12, and a positive times a negative means I'm going to have a negative answer. And my final answer here is negative 11/12. All right, you know what? It's time for you to do your own check on page 206. I'd like you to pause the video, try this problem, decide if you're going to work it out in fraction or decimal form, and then push play when you're ready to check your answer. All right, how'd you do on this one? If you decided to do it in decimal form, you would have shown your work here on your page. And one thing to remember is that when you're multiplying and you have 4 decimal places in your factors, then you need to have 4 decimal places in your product. And those last 2 zeros cancel out. So we ended with an answer of 0.16 or 16/100ths. Now, when you worked with if you did a fraction instead over here, it would have been advisable to simplify this first fraction before you did any multiplication. So I took negative 64/100ths, turned it into negative 16/25ths, and then I simplified before I multiplied, and I got 4/25. These two answers are exactly the same, just one's in decimal form, one's in fraction form. Give yourself a star if you got it correct. All right, the next one I'm going to do is on page 207. This is example 4. Again, you can watch me do it, or you can write it in the margin with me if that's helpful to you. All right, so we're going to evaluate 1/2 AB if A equals 1 3/7 and B equals negative 4/9. All right, so I'm going to be multiplying 1/2 times 1 3/7 times -4/9. All right, before I go any further, I like to look and decide, am I going to have a positive or negative product here? Since I've got one negative number, I know that at the end I'm going to have a negative. So I'm just going to kind of do that now so I don't forget about it. All right, and then I'm going to go ahead and turn these mixed numbers into fractions. I don't want to use decimals because sevenths and ninths are repeating decimals. So I've got 1/2 times 7, 8, 9, 10 sevenths times -4/9. Again, I can kind of ignore that negative right now, or I can write it. It's up to you guys. All right, now when you're working with three factors, you can still, or you should still, simplify before you multiply. But remember, we're just looking for one factor that can be divided out of the top and one that can come out of the bottom. So I like to look diagonally, up and down, something like that. So on this particular one, I'm looking and I see 2 and 10 are both divisible by 2. So that leaves me with a 5 on top there and a 1 on bottom. And looks like that's it. There's no other common factors within here. So now I'm just going to multiply straight across, and I see a 1 times 5 times 4, that's 20, and a 1 times 7 times 6 is 63. And then I had a positive, and a negative. So I get -20 over 63. And that's as simplified as I can get it. All right? All right, you know what time it is, guys. It's time for you to do your own check. On page 207, I'd like you to pause the video, try this check, and make sure that you have your final answer locked in before you push play to check it. All right, the final answer on this one is 133/12 or 11 1/12. If you got that correct, give yourself a star and keep moving. If you got yours incorrect, see if you can retrace your steps, compare them to mine, and spot your error. And my final example for today is found on page 208. This is example 5. This one we are multiplying 4 rational numbers. And I see we have 1/4 times 9.5 times -0.8 times 2 and 1/5. All right, now since I've done so many that were in fraction form, I'm actually going to tackle this one as decimals. And it would be up to you which way you did it when it was your turn. So I've got to turn each of my fractions into decimals. I've got 0.25, 9.5, -0.8, and 2.2. All right, when you're multiplying, you're only really doing 2 numbers at a time. So I'm going to start with, I think, these two, and I'm going to multiply over to the side here. I've got 9.5 times 0.25, and remember, when you multiply, you don't need to line up your decimals, but we will need to know how many decimal places are in our 2 factors for when we're done here. But 5 times 5 is 25. 45, 46, 47. All right, I am done with my first column. Place a 0 there. Now I've got 2 times 5, which is 10. Carry the 1. 18 and 1 make 19. Add these together, and we are going to get 5, 7, 13, and 2. All right, now a reminder here in my product, I should have 1, 2, 3 decimal places from the right. So I'm going to go 1, 2, 3. And my number is 2.375. Those were both positive numbers, so I'm going to keep this as 2.375. And now I'm still multiplying that by -0.8 and 2.2. I'm just going to go ahead and multiply these two next. So I've got 2.2 times 0.8. And 2 times 8 is 16. 16 plus 1 is 17. And I've got 2 decimal places, so I go 1.76. So right now I've got 2.375 times -1.76, because remember, we had a negative factor within there. And the final thing I need to do is multiply those last two factors. So I have 2.375 and 1.76, and I'll deal with that negative later. All right, so 6 times 5 is 30, and I got 42, 43, 44, 45. And I've got 18 plus 4 is 22, and 12 plus 2 is 14. I'm done with those carries and add a 0 down below. All right, now I've got 7 times 5 is 35. 7 times 7 is 49, 50, 51, 52. Carry the 5. 7 times 3 is 21, plus 5 is 26. And 7 times 2 is 14, plus 2 is 16. All right, now I'm going to be done with those. And I'm going to add my 2 zeros here to show that I'm over 2 decimal places. And now I've got a 5 times 1, 7 times 1, 3 times 1, and 2 times 1. And we can add each of these together. All right, be careful with your columns here. So all those zeros are going to give me a 0. And we've got a 10. And we've got another 10. And then I've got 13, 14, 18. Carry the 1. Oops, that was all these. Okay, now I got 9, 10, 11, and 4. All right, then I've got to figure out my decimal places. I had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 decimal places in my factors. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So this looks like it should be 4.18. And again, I had a negative that I was multiplying by, and there was only one of them. So I'm going to go with negative 4 18/100. And the time has come for your final check. I'd like you to pause on page 208 and complete this check, showing each step as you go, and then push play when you are ready to check in on how you did. All right, when I worked mine out, I got negative 18/13, or negative 1 5/13. Again, this one would not be left in decimal form because it is not a terminating decimal. Give yourself a star if you got this one correct. All right, it's time to stop and think about it. Based on your work on the checks today, do you feel like you can use the rules for multiplying integers to multiply rational numbers? I'd like you to write down on the bottom of page 208 a number 1 through 5 based on the FIST to 5 assessment. All right, and we will go through more of these in class down the road, but this should get you started. Thanks for watching.